My grandmother always said that pumpkins were an omen of disaster. I liked pumpkins, though, and she was senile. So, like most grandkids and their well-meaning but heavily misinformed grandparents, I shrugged it off, and when I got my own place, I decided to start my very own pumpkin patch. I'd never been one for spring or pastels or things of the like. I was more of an autumn girl. I loved faded fall colors and oranges and blacks. My favorite days were the rainy or overcast days. I hated the heat and I always loved the cold. Nothing was better than having a pumpkin spice latte, sitting inside wearing a sweater and reading a good book. My pumpkins were doing pretty well. They were almost ripe enough for me to pick them and start carving them, even though it was far from Halloween. I'd carve a couple and then save the rest for some recipes I'd been wanting to try out. Well, that's what I was planning anyway. Until it happened. I woke up one day and looked out the window and saw that my garden had been totally smashed. I thought it had been some prank, that some kids or teenagers or whatever just came in and smashed all of them, not thinking about the consequences, but when I came out, it was something completely different. There was a broom in the pumpkin patch. And standing behind it was a man that looked like he had just come out of the Witcher series on Netflix. He seemed a little frazzled and quickly apologized. I thought he was some weirdo or maybe even a LARPer or something on his way to the D&D convention or whatever. But he quickly apologized and told me that he was a witch. Was Halloween closer than I thought? Or was he just really into character? I forgave him and told him that it was fine, that I could just grow some more. But he felt really bad about it and asked if there was something that he could do. So, humoring him, I jokingly said, okay, well, if you really want to do something about it, why don't you just use your witchcraft or whatever to bring the pumpkins back? Except when I asked that, he did. He started speaking this language I couldn't begin to even fathom, and then, just like that, my pumpkin patch was brand new. I was way confused at this. First of all, this is the real world, but second of all, okay, suppose this is actually real and it's not some intense dream or something. If he always had this power, why didn't he just fix the pumpkins immediately? And why was he just waiting around for me to come out and find him? I voiced this to him. I asked, why didn't you just fix them before I came out? And he said that a witch can't use their powers unless someone asks for something. I did not know that. I noticed that his broom had actually been snapped in half, so I asked if he wanted to come in and tell me more about his profession while I attempted to fix it. He sheepishly agreed and seemed really happy to be invited inside. I gave him some water and coffee and then helped him fix his broom. All the while, he was going on and on and on about witchcraft and magic and his powers, which kind of went on a little too long and I didn't understand the majority of it. He said he was new to it, that he was chosen. I asked him what else he'd used his magic for, and he said that this was the first time, aside from flying on a broom. Granted, he was no ordinary-looking guy. He was actually very tall and very built, so the idea of this huge guy riding on this tiny little broom in the middle of the day was quite hilarious to me. I asked him why I was the first person that he'd ever used magic to help. And then he said something pretty interesting that I haven't really ever heard of in terms of lore with witches. He said that every time a witch uses magic, this thing called the desire gets stronger and stronger. The Desire, I said. What does that mean? He told me he didn't know, that he'd been instructed by more seasoned witches out there and warned him not to always use magic, to only use it in the most detrimental of times. I quipped back, and fixing my pumpkin patch was detrimental? And he said, well, yes, of course it was detrimental. He had felt extremely guilty about having been irresponsible enough to break something of someone else's while flying around on his broom. I asked for more specifics as to what this desire was, but he didn't really seem to know either. It's like the seasoned witches had barely told him anything and just let him off to figure it all out on his own. We got to talking, and after a few hours, I had completely forgotten about the pumpkin patch and realized I didn't know his name. Embarrassed, I introduced myself, admitting how late I was, and he responded with his name, and I'll admit, a lot of our interests kinda lined up. Not romantically or anything, I'm not looking for a relationship right now, but he did seem like a really interesting person to hang out with who I could really talk to about stuff, and even though he was kind of a weirdo, that was forgivable. While I was making something for us for lunch, I had accidentally cut my palm, and he got extremely worried and used his magic to help heal my hand. I jokingly warned him about the desire, and maybe he'd become a vampire, and that's why he couldn't use magic too much, or else he would have just pounded at my hand right then and there. And then he told me that he was actually legitimately very curious about what would happen if he did use too much magic. And I admit it, I was curious too. Once the words left my lips, I saw this intense glimmer in his eyes. He gazed back at me. And he held out his hand and he said, "Would you like to try?" What was he asking? Would I like to try what? Being a witch? I thought about it for a second. He seemed nice, and even though I didn't really understand everything, and I had grown up with this silly superstition that pumpkins are bad omens or whatever, my grandmother had passed away a long time ago. And it was just a superstition, right? If I took this virtual stranger's hand and became like him, would it really be a bad omen?
Thank you for watching this video. Big shout out to my patrons, Leaf Ninja, Roy Larimer, Mr. Creepypasta, Nicole Kister, Neon Scoundrel, William Delphin, and So Much Heresy. If you want to become a patron, buy merch, or join my Discord server, be sure to check out the links in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.